In 1987, Frank Miller and David Mazzucchelli, and I have no idea if that's how you pronounce his name, produced this. This was a new take on the Batman origin story, Year One, Part One. And this is the actual original comic from '87. Why am I showing you a Batman comic from 1987? Well, because today's video is about essay writing. And the interesting thing about Year One, Part One is that we all really knew the Batman origin story. But what they did was they recreated it, and they gave it, new images, some new details. The actual character of Batman changed a bit. They reproduced something that we already knew. And in doing so, they changed it. Essay writing, in a way, is doing something similar. You're reproducing something that you already know, and chances are that the person marking your essay also already knows. But when you start writing an essay, it probably doesn't feel like that. In fact, it probably is somewhat representative of this white wall, this blank wall behind me. A blank slate, and you have to fill in the content. You got to give it some color. You got to give it some imagery. You got to give it detail. So in today's video, we're going to talk with Professor Patrick Jackson from American University in Washington, D.C. And we're going to talk about essay writing. And I hope that in conversation with Professor Jackson that you will help, that we'll be able to help you develop clearer strategies for work on your own essays. But before we start, I just want to add a few comments about essay writing in general and why we're doing this video. So the first comment is, so Batman Year One is a comic book, it's fiction, right? You're not writing fiction, you're writing nonfiction. And one of the key differences, other than that it's not fictional, is your readers, your assessors, aren't really looking for a murder mystery or a mystery novel. We want to know what you're going to say, and we want to know how you're going to say it. Kind of like Batman Year One, we know that Bruce Wayne becomes Batman, right? Similarly, in your essays, we're going to want to know what it is you're going to tell us. So your thesis statement is really, really important. And the coming up with a good thesis statement can be really difficult. But a thesis statement is crucial in being able to develop a clearly structured and plausible essay. The second thing I want to say is writing is hard. And, we often do feel, stuck with our word choices, stuck with essay structure, and, you just got to kind of force yourself through it. But, take comfort in knowing that, all of us can, myself included, do find writing to be challenging, although I do enjoy it. I like the creative element of it. I feel like you're actually producing something. It's kind of cool. And, and try if you can to enjoy that process. Welcome, Professor and Jedi Knight. Delighted to have you here, Patrick. We're going to, as we spoke about before, we're going to talk about essay writing. And I thought maybe we could open up by what sort of general advice you give to your students about how to go about drafting an essay.
Well, thanks for having me. It's always fun to have these kinds of conversations, and in particular to focus on pedagogy, which I know we've done in other sorts of formats before, but sometimes pedagogy is not front and center in our profession because we spend a lot of time thinking about our publications and our research, which is important, but it's really good just to have the opportunity to kind of think through some of these questions of pedagogy and teaching. Essays. So when it comes to essays, when I am working with my own students on how to craft an essay, the thing I will always tell them is you have one paragraph to hook the reader. In the beginning, you've got to start with something that pulls the reader in and gets the reader interested, get the reader invested in reading the rest of the piece. An essay is generally reasonably short. You don't have several pages to sort of slowly develop your point. It's, I need to know up front where you're going. And that doesn't necessarily have to be the first sentence, but by the end of the first paragraph, I should have a pretty good sense of what is going on in the rest of the essay, a little bit of a roadmap, at least some sense of what the destination is. And that kind of quick, sharp articulation. The other thing I tell them, you should avoid the general undergraduate writing cliches that we have since the beginning of time, since time immemorial, since the beginning of recorded history, et cetera, et cetera. So don't go there. But what you want is you want something relatively stimulating that you can pull people in with and then say, oh, now I actually want to read the rest of this. And sometimes if you're a student writing an essay for a professor, you may think you don't have to do that because, well, of course the professor has to read the essay because they have to grade it, they have to mark it. True, but how much better is it if the professor actually wants to read the essay to see how you're going to develop your point? So think really hard about that beginning. What I'll sometimes then follow that up with advice for my students is whatever you write first as a first paragraph is probably not going to be the version that makes it to the final. You write your way through the essay, you figure out where you've gotten by the end, and then say, oh, is that what I was going to do? Most common comment I make on essay drafts, when a student drafts an essay and then is going to revise it and turn in a final essay, the most common comment I make is, oh, by your last paragraph, this was really clear. So think about taking that last paragraph that you wrote in your first draft and making that your first paragraph, and then developing the rest of the essay around that. Sometimes you've got to write your way to that point before you can actually write the final version of the essay. And that's a very typical pattern. I mean, I see that in my own writing sometimes. You write your way to a position and then go, oh, okay, now I know where I've gotten. Now I've got to make sure that I can lead the reader there, but they don't necessarily have to follow the same strange, torturous path that I took initially to get there. Now that I've like climbed up the mountain, I can look down and say, oh, okay, there's an easier path over there. That's the path that the essay is actually going to take. So
that's so true. I mean, I tell my students similar things about what I call meaningless sentences, and it's those, you know, time immemorial phrases that you mentioned, but also I think sentences that don't really say anything, you know, that, you know, sentences where you're reading it and you're going, well, you haven't actually told me any information I don't already know just from the question, asking the question. And I think it's getting that thesis statement, you know, really early in the essay, because we're not asking to write a mystery novel, right? You want to know where you're going to take me.
Right, exactly. And sometimes if I'm talking specifically to students in the US, I'll use certain, you know, sports allusions or whatever to try to help clarify this. So one thing I will tell a student is when you're first writing a draft of an essay, it's kind of like in a baseball game where a new pitcher comes in and the pitcher gets a few warm-up tosses. They get to throw some balls just to get a sense of feeling how their mechanics are and how's the mound and what's the atmosphere like today and so on before they actually start playing. So think of your draft as your warm-up tosses, and then you go, oh, okay, now that I've gotten there. So even you're writing your first draft, those meaningless sentences might show up because they're like things that you use, but they're never going to make it to the final draft. They're handholds that you use to pull yourself along. So it's like when you're first writing a draft, turn off your critical faculties and just like throw stuff at the paper, and then it's there, and then say, oh, where did that get me now? But don't turn that in, please don't turn that in. Instead, you get to the end and say, all right, now after I've played around in this a little bit, now I've got a good crisp thesis. Now I can go back and say, well, this point actually works to develop the thesis, so let me tweak that to make sure that it actually sort of hangs on the backbone of the essay a little bit. So,
I feel like the thesis statement is something that I don't know if there's a cultural issue here, but I feel that it's something that a lot of students in UK, a lot of students I teach, really seem to struggle with understanding what it is, right? Mm-hmm. And I don't know if it's just about the directness of it, but I think it's really important about, you know, it's really important when you're writing to really be very clear what you're going to argue in the piece, and that should be, you know, somewhere in the first paragraph. I mean, do you advise your students the same?
Definitely. And I think that some of it is a cultural difference. Some of it's also just a genre of writing difference, right? Because a lot of things that people read that are called essays are a bit more, shall we say, literary rather than expository. And in that kind of a setting, having the theme emerge gradually if somebody's a really good writer and they can sort of pull you through to that, you know, you read an essay in, I don't know, The Atlantic or something, then okay, sure, but they can do that. because they're really good at what they do, and they have editors that make sure that what you're seeing is like the 18th draft, right? So they've really refined this. It's really hard to actually pull that off. It's actually a lot easier to make sure that the essay coheres if you are pretty crisp up front. So even something as prosaic as in this essay, I will argue, right? And you may want to change that around and make it a little bit less blunt as you go through drafts, but even just a statement like that can be really helpful. Just
Yeah, I usually tell my students, start writing, in this essay, I will argue that, and then you can just delete the first phrase of that, right? In this essay, I will argue, just delete that. I totally agree. You read these fascinating pieces, whether you mention the Atlantic. I mean, I remember essays in Harper's or, the London Review of Books, and you can just see these authors just take you on these amazing, journeys. And you think, wow, I'm going to try writing like that. And then, my undergraduate essays were a disaster. And I don't think I could write like that even now if I tried. And I sort of feel it's a little bit ironic, academics try to teach how to write, considering we are not known for our writing skills.
Yeah. If one is a gifted prose stylist, one is probably not going into academia, because there are other things you can do with that kind of thing. Not to say that there isn't good academic writing. It's that it's rarer than you would expect, because a lot of expository writing, if you think this through, sort of what the point of an essay is, and not just the simple answer, if you're a student, the point of the essay is to get a good mark on it, right? So fine. But if we move outside of that framework for a second, if I'm writing an essay, my goal in doing so is to take the reader from someplace and move them somewhere else, right? I'm trying to get them to agree ultimately with my conclusion. And because that's the point of that kind of analytical writing, the devices that I use have to serve that. It can't just sort of be pretty for its own sake. It has to actually move you. And it's not sufficient to take people on a tour. That can be great for a different kind of essay, where I'm not really going to take you to a particular place. I'm going to show you some things that are really interesting. I'm going to think through some things with you. Great. Good lectures can work that way too, right? I'm going to think through a problem and show you different ways of doing this. Great. But an essay, especially a student analytical essay, is not a lecture. It's neither here's how much I know, nor is it here's some cool stuff that I found. It's I've got a point. I want to deliver that point, and I want to get you at the end of the day to agree with my point by showing you things that help support it, or showing you alternatives and telling you why you're not going to go down that road. So often one metaphor I'll sometimes use with the students is, imagine that you're reaching through your screen to the reader. You're grabbing them by the nose and you're going to pull them in particular directions, right? And then if you're writing something, you say, well, I don't know where I was pulling the reader in this paragraph. Maybe that paragraph doesn't belong there. Right? Maybe that does, and you can't answer that question about a particular point until you know what the thesis is, because then you could say, well, am I actually getting people to go along? One of my favorite lines about this that I will quote all the time is a little quip of Ludwig Wittgenstein's that I found in one of his journals, where he is having a conversation with some folks in Vienna, and they're thinking through questions of what does it mean to have a problem and solve a problem? What does it mean to ask a question? And he says, only when I know how to answer a question do I know what the question means, which I take to mean something like, only when I can clearly state what the argument is can I actually make the argument. And that doesn't happen until much later on in the process sometimes, which is why you will kind of fumble around or write your way to something. Even in my own writing, I'll sit down and write, and sometimes I'll junk the first 3-4 pages because I was getting warmed up. Then I know enough to be able to say, now I can clearly ask the question. And now that I can clearly ask the question, now I can clearly state the thesis. Now the rest of this thing all falls together. So you're going for that kind of clarity. The illusion is then when you write it, it's presented as if you had that clarity at the beginning. And you don't always. You develop that clarity through the process, and until you get to that clarity, you're not far enough along yet.
And I think that's what a lot of students forget is, the end product looks like it's been a very, linear set, linear journey, right? Here's the intro, here's conclusion, and it's, very, very logically put together, very, hopefully clear. But the actual journey isn't like that, right? It's, kind of going all over the place. And then you have to go back and, you know, put that structure in there, which I think is the other question, I guess, about clear writing, whether it's first year or PhD or monograph writing, is how you go about thinking about the structure of what you're working on, and with what the role of the structure is in the overall essay.
Let me read you the specific Wittgenstein quote just to get that sort of clear, because I think it goes along the same lines we've been talking about. It is only the method of answering the question that tells you what the question was really about. Only when I have answered a question can I know what it was aimed at.
That's interesting. It's the method of answering. It's not the answer.
No, it's the way of answering, which of course is what you are, to use another kind of Wittgensteinian illusion, what you are showing rather than saying by the way that you construct the essay is the method of answering the question. Here are the points I'm going to make. Here are the counter arguments. Here's the literature I want to consult. Here's the examples I want to use. All of those things arranged in a particular way. Until you figured out how to do that arrangement, you don't really know what the question was about. So it's this interactive process of, I think I've got it. I want to write this. I put these pieces in. I stand back. I have somebody else take a look at it. Now, eventually, I find my crisp question, my crisp thesis that I can put up front. And the rest of the arrangement just kind of follows from it, because they all were born as a unit from my productive struggling through different drafts.
And I think that's so important for anyone who's writing to think about it in that way, because especially though for undergraduate students, and I guess possibly master's students, when we're not asking them for a novel contribution to knowledge, and they're so concerned, but I got to say something new, and actually what you're looking for is that sort of clarity in that structure, that clarity of how they answered this, and that's their contribution, right? That's their demonstration of skill and the grasp of the subject.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's one of the harsh truths for any undergraduate is you're probably not actually going to bring something completely novel to the table in anything that you write, because chances are somebody's already been there. They've already kind of written about this, so on and so forth. It actually takes a lot of experience and training to find something genuinely novel in a well-established field or discipline or tradition of inquiry. And that's why people go to grad school, so they can read everything and then say, oh, well, nobody wrote about this little tiny sliver of this piece over here. Chances of an undergraduate student stumbling onto something like that are very minimal. So instead of, I want to say something new, it's, can I say something insightful? Can I say something meaningful? Can I say something that accomplishes the main goal of the essay, which is to make an argument, and make a persuasive argument that you're going to be able to pull somebody along with, which may be an argument that other people have made, but that's not the point. The point is you're able to make the argument. You're able to do it. You gain the capacity to make this argument and the capacity to evaluate other people making this argument. There were a number of, I remember things that I wrote when I was an undergrad where I thought, this is just the most original thing. Like, no one's ever done this before. I remember talking to one of my favorite professors and said, well, I thought that was pretty novel. I hadn't seen that before. Whereupon he reached behind him in his office and pulled out 4 different books that were exactly on the particular point that I thought was totally novel about, like, it was a history class, and it's a European history class. Like, it was about Bismarck's techniques of ruling in the early days of the German Empire. And it was like, oh gosh, I guess this is totally not novel. I guess other people have been all over this ground before. It was this just really important moment where I was, oh, novelty may not actually be the thing to aim for here. Maybe the thing to aim for is a well-crafted argument that pulls the reader to a place that I think is defensible.
I remember with my undergraduate essay, so I actually, in school before I went to university, I was in French immersion. So I learned how to write very badly or not at all in French and English. So by the time I got to college and then university, I was like, I didn't really have much proper writing training. So my stepdad, who actually taught English at the college where I started school, he would proofread my essays before I would hand them in, and we would sit there at the kitchen table going over these essays, and it was just like, this is not English. I have no idea what you're saying here. You have produced an entirely new syntactic structure hitherto never seen before in the history of humankind. Like, what are there was just, it was just totally messy. And, and the thing is, like, that was every essay for years, right? It took years. And, I don't know, I still make grammatical mistakes, I'm sure of it, but it's, it's that process. And I think, it's okay to make these mistakes, and it doesn't have to be perfect. And, the skill takes time, right? It's not something which happens immediately, and that there is a big difference between learning to write for an exam, which is really what happens in the UK, and what we're asking them to do, which is develop an argument. Correct. and or explain a concept. Like this is one of the other things I think that students, at least some of my students, struggle with, is the difference between developing a thesis and being able to explain something in your own words. Because sometimes I feel a lot of students feel that when you're asking to explain something, they say, well, I'm just copying someone else, I'm just plagiarizing.
Right.
And, they seem to struggle with that difference. Do you find that that's the case with some of your students?
Yeah. I mean, it depends sometimes on what kind of course it is. When it's a course that's, say, a research design course, which I teach a fair number of, I find that to be less of an issue, because I will tell students, if you find somebody who's designed a piece of research that you want to do something on the similar kind of design, then please borrow what they're doing, cite it appropriately, and apply it to your own case. So it's a slightly different kind of thing. But when I'm teaching, say, Intro to International Studies or International Theory, and I will ask essay questions in which I want students to explain, say, the differences between Hobbes and Rousseau on the notion of legitimate state authority, which is a standard kind of essay question that I use in that class. And it's a challenging question because neither Hobbes nor Rousseau really use the word legitimacy very much.
I was just thinking, how would I answer that? That's a tough question.
But because in class we have talked about the way rule is justified, and I've been using, because I set it up because later on in the semester we'll read Weber, because it's a course of mine, we can't not read Weber, it's just necessary. And so I have them go and do that, and they will start, they're going to be doing a lot of explicating. So it's, here's a text and here's what the text says. And I will have students who say, okay, this kind of feels like I'm just copying whole passages out of Hobbes. I'll say, okay, so take a step back. Think about, like, there's two elements of creativity that you have as an essay writer when it comes to an essay like that, where you're fleshing out a concept. One of them is in your selection of what you're quoting directly. So why this quotation? Why this one rather than that one? There's lots of things in Hobbes that you could grab to talk about state authority. Large portions of the book that aren't about scriptural interpretation or censored data are about state authority, right? So you can find lots of stuff in Leviathan. So why do you choose particular quotations? And again, goes back to the point and the purpose of writing the essay, which is trying to move the reader in a particular direction. So not just brain dump of all the stuff that I know about Hobbes, which I don't know how your PhD comprehensive exams went, but certainly by the time I got to my PhD comprehensive exams, it was this timed situation where you just had to basically spew out everything that you knew about particular points of literature. So it was like, go, 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 go. That's different. So with this, so step one is which quotations are you using? But then the other thing that I think it's important to impress on students, and I certainly try to impress on my students, never assume that a quotation is self-explanatory. So me giving you two sentences from Hobbes doesn't necessarily communicate to you what I got from those two sentences in Hobbes. So I'm going to have to clarify what it is that I took and what, because it's an essay, I therefore want you to take. So here's something that Hobbes said. Now let me develop a little bit. I think what this means is da 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 da. One of the obstacles I find that some of my students come into this process with is that somewhere along the course of their pre-university education, it has been beaten into them that you should never use the pronoun I in a piece of writing that you're doing for school. And I understand the intent of that, because teachers want to have students not just express an opinion. But on the other hand, when you're writing an essay, you can't not have a take. You have to have a position. And if the best way grammatically to do that is to say I have absolutely no objection to students doing that. So a student writing about Hobbes saying, I take this quotation to mean blah, 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 blah. Great. You need that connecting tissue to be able to take the specific thing that's come out of the text and embed it in a broader interpretive framework that you, the author, are developing. And it is yours. Now, it may also be widely shared by other people, so maybe there's people to cite, but that's a separate question. There has to be a take that the essay has, that you as the essayist have on this particular material. So it's less about simply repeating what other people have said and more about using what they have said to help move the reader where you want the reader to be moved.
I think it's a really good point, and maybe the last point that we can talk about just sort of expands on that. When we before we start recording, unsurprisingly, either of us, we were talking a little bit about Mandalorian and Star Wars, and I mean Star Wars is in some ways incredibly unoriginal. Right, it's the hero of 1,000 faces. It's Joseph Campbell. It's these very traditional myths that that Campbell identifies as being in all these different civilizations, and yet still there's something very original, very powerful about Star Wars, and it's how you put that information together, amongst other things, right? That has that's so powerful and that's so meaniful, I think, and I think that's a lesson for students is that you take a quote, the quote. It's someone else has said it, but you're now using it as part of something else. The quote can't do it by itself, right? It's not going to do the heavy lifting by itself, right? If I just throw some random hero in a story and there's just a hero and I don't know what the hero's doing, it doesn't really help me very much. There has to be something else, all the context that you're adding to it, your voice that tells, and explains why it's so important about this quote. How's it working? Where is it taking? How is it taking you to that end that you want the reader to get to?
Well, and I think referencing The Mandalorian and Star Wars is actually really appropriate for something like this, because there's very little in the Star Wars universe that is completely original.
I don't think there's anything really.
It's drawn from what is strikingly original about Star Wars is the particular kind of combination of things.
Yes.
So here we have this archetypal character and this archetypal character and this archetypal situation, but they're kind of shuffled a little bit in ways that are a bit unfamiliar. And then it's like, oh, okay. I mean, in some ways, the biggest, most important innovation that George Lucas made in the original Star Wars films was having his space adventure be kind of used. So the ships were like dusty and dirty and kind of banged up. And before you look at other sci-fi that had been displayed on camera, either in film or television, before Star Wars came out in '77, and the ships are always clean and crisp, and there's no dirt on the Starship Enterprise. Right? There certainly aren't bruises. And then you get to the Millennium Falcon and, Luke walks into Docking Bay 97 and says, what a piece of junk. And it looks like a piece of junk. And that used universe thing, which had been done in non-sci-fi films before, but had never really been done in a film that had these sorts of space elements to it. Lucas just took those things and combined them a little bit. And the result is strikingly novel. So the individuality of that kind of crafting, that kind of craftspersonship, is in the way you combine elements and not in, I've got to come up with something entirely novel this way. I mean, I know, like, for my own scholarly career, even, like, there will be two things that I will be remembered for, and they're both diagrams that I came up with at various points in time, right? So the 2x2 from Conduct of Inquiry and the fractal diagram that breaks down vocations of science and politics. And those are not particularly original. They're ways of organizing stuff that other people did. They're combinations. But the combination itself has proven useful for other people in their thinking. And so therefore it continues. Star Wars, the combination of those things proved inspirational to other people. And so they kept going with that combination. And that's where you end up with all of these other products, not just later Star Wars things, but other stuff that is indebted to Star Wars. So originality comes in the combination in a lot of ways. I mean, Shakespeare didn't entirely make stuff up from scratch, right? He built on stuff and put things together and figured out ways of harmonizing things, and there you go, right? That's where our creativity is, as that kind of a symbolic arranger, shall we say. So if you're an undergraduate student writing an essay, think less about I have to make a completely novel point, and more, oh, these things going together make sense to me. And I'm going to use that, and that arrangement, that can be where your voice is, right? In the arranging.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's great advice to end on. Just like to say thank you so much
Hey,
for joining us, and maybe we'll do this again and talk about more popular culture and politics.
slightly shabby and slightly weird is kind of what we do. Good Lord, I'm sitting here with a jacket and I got a Morellian concert T-shirt on because I've been using most of my wardrobe choices during pandemic to introduce my students to bands they've never heard of before. And it's funny because the number of bands they've never heard of before is immense. So the other day I went in to teach and I had a David Bowie shirt on. They're like, "Oh, who's that?" And I'm like, "What?"
Oh dear! You realize now this is what I'm going to use to finish our interview with. Is
Absolutely. Well, because
clip.
we had to go off for a good 10 minutes for me to explain who David Bowie was and why it was important that they know David Bowie. And they're like, "What, really?" And I'm like, "No. So have you ever seen this cover before?" And they're like, because it's Heroes, right? And so and they're like, "Wait, oh, I've seen," and then they have all the parodies, but they've never seen the original. Right, because people have done the sort of iconic Heroes pose forever, right? But they've never seen or listened to the original. So then just to screw with their heads, I played them a little bit of the ambient side 2 of Heroes, and they're like, "This is really weird."
And what is side 2?
So
no. I mean, they must have asked, "What is side 2?"
Yeah, they did ask that. They weren't sure what that meant. I sort of had to explain that. I remember, it's somewhat apocryphal, but it has actually happened to me once that I've used the expression "like a broken record" and nobody understood what I meant.